9-year-old Toby didn't know the hulking man in the heavy leather vest was a high-ranking enforcer for the Hells Angels. He just saw someone who looked exactly as lonely as he felt. A simple half-sandwich sparked a chain reaction that would literally shake the foundations of his elementary school. The late afternoon sun baked the cracked pavement of Bakersfield, California, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. 9-year-old Toby Jenkins dragged his feet, his worn-out sneakers scuffing the dirt path that bordered Centennial Park. He was small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a frame that looked like it could be blown over by a stiff breeze. Today, that frame was hunched under the weight of a faded blue backpack and a heavy heart. Toby always took the long way home. The direct route meant passing the local convenience store, which was the preferred loitering spot for Derek Thompson and his older brother's friends. Derek was a 12-year-old terror who had made it his personal mission to make Toby's life a living nightmare. From stolen lunch money to bruised ribs, Toby bore the silent, invisible scars of a kid who had fallen through the cracks of a negligent school system and an exhausted, single-parent household. His mother worked double shifts at a diner out on the highway, meaning Toby was entirely on his own from the time the school bell rang until the streetlights flickered on. As Toby navigated the dusty trail of the park, a low, rhythmic rumbling broke the silence. It sounded like a thunderstorm trapped inside a metal cage. Parked illegally on the grass near a secluded grove of oak trees was a massive, custom Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Its chrome gleamed aggressively in the sun, matte black paint absorbing the heat. Sitting on a weathered wooden bench a few feet from the bike was a mountain of a man. He wore heavy denim jeans, scarred engineer boots, and a thick leather cut over a black t-shirt. The back of his vest proudly displayed the iconic red and white winged death's head patch, flanked by rockers that read Hells Angels and Bakersfield. His arms were thick with faded, intricate tattoos, and a long graying beard cascaded down his chest. His face was a map of hard miles and harder fights, dominated by a deep scar cutting through his left eyebrow. This was Mike Gallagher. On the streets, they called him Iron Mike. He was a veteran of the club, a man who had seen the inside of penitentiaries and the dark underbelly of the outlaw biker world. But right now, Mike didn't look dangerous. He looked entirely broken. Mike was staring blankly at the dirt between his boots, his massive shoulders slumped. In his right hand, he held a small, crumpled photograph. Today was the 10-year anniversary of the day his younger brother had been killed in a hit-and-run just 2 blocks from this very park. Mike came to this specific bench every year, sitting in absolute, brooding silence, consumed by a grief that decades of riding and brotherhood couldn't wash away. Toby froze, his instincts screaming at him to turn around and run. The man looked terrifying. Yet something kept Toby rooted to the spot. The boy knew what misery looked like. He saw it in the mirror every morning before school. He saw it in his mother's eyes when she looked at the unpaid utility bills. And he saw it now, radiating from the giant biker. Toby swallowed the lump in his throat and took a tentative step forward. Then another. Mike's peripheral vision caught the movement. His head snapped up, his pale blue eyes locking onto the scrawny kid. The biker's jaw tightened, irritated by the intrusion on his private morning. "Park's closed, kid," Mike rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Go play somewhere else." Toby flinched but didn't retreat. He clutched his hands tightly around the straps of his backpack. Slowly, he unzipped the front pocket and pulled out a small, slightly squashed object wrapped in aluminum foil. It was his lunch. He hadn't eaten it at school because Derek had cornered him in the cafeteria, forcing Toby to hide in the library. "You look sad," Toby said, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the quiet park. "My mum says you shouldn't be sad on an empty stomach." Mike stared at the kid, dumbfounded. People usually crossed the street when they saw him coming. Grown men avoided eye contact. Cops watched him with hands resting on their holsters. And here was a kid, no taller than his waist, offering him charity. Toby took 2 more steps and gently placed the foil-wrapped package on the edge of the bench, giving the biker a wide berth. "It's just peanut butter and jelly, but it's the good jelly, strawberry." Mike looked from the sandwich to the boy. For a fleeting second, the hardened enforcer saw a ghost. His little brother used to trade his turkey sandwiches for strawberry jam in the 3rd grade. A heavy, suffocating knot tightened in Mike's chest. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand and picked up the foil. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing the perfectly cut diagonal halves. "You ain't eating?" Mike asked, his tone slightly less hostile. "I'm not hungry," Toby lied, his stomach immediately betraying him with a loud rumble. A faint, rusty chuckle escaped Mike's lips. It was a sound he hadn't made in weeks. He broke one of the halves into a smaller piece and held it out to Toby. "Sit. You don't insult a man by letting him eat alone." Hesitantly, Toby sat on the far edge of the bench. For the next 10 minutes, an unlikely silence settled over them. A feared outlaw biker and a bullied 9-year-old boy sharing a squashed peanut butter sandwich in the sweltering California heat. "I'm Mike," the biker grunted, wiping a crumb from his beard. "Toby." "Well, Toby," Mike said, his sharp eyes suddenly noticing the faint, yellowish bruising around the boy's collarbone that peeked out from his oversized t-shirt, and the nervous flinch every time a car drove past the park. "You better get home before your mum starts worrying." Toby nodded, grabbing his backpack. "Bye, Mike. I hope you feel better." Mike watched the boy trudge away, noting the slight limp in his walk. The biker's eyes narrowed. He knew the look of a victim. He folded the remaining piece of tin foil, slipped it into his leather vest pocket next to the photo of his brother, and felt a strange, protective spark ignite in his chest. The next morning dawned with a suffocating humidity that promised an unbearable day. For Toby, the weather was the least of his concerns. As he approached Oak Creek Elementary, a knot of pure dread formed in his stomach. He almost made it to the front doors. "Hey, trash!" a voice spat from the shadow of the portable classrooms. Toby froze. Derek Thompson stepped out from behind a dumpster, flanked by 2 of his larger, meaner cronies. They had been waiting. Derek had been reprimanded by a teacher the previous day because Toby had snitched by hiding in the library, and Derek was eager to exact his revenge. Before Toby could turn and run, a hand grabbed the back of his shirt, yanking him violently into the secluded alley between the brick wall of the gymnasium and the chain-link fence. Toby hit the ground hard, scraping his palms and knees on the rough gravel. "Think you can hide from me?" Derek sneered, stepping forward and kicking Toby's backpack, scattering his notebooks and pencils into the dirt. "Leave me alone, Derek," Toby pleaded, scrambling backward. One of the older boys laughed, stepping on Toby's hand. "Make us." What followed was a brutal, terrifying 5 minutes. They tore the straps off Toby's backpack, stomped his plastic lunchbox into jagged shards, and shoved him repeatedly into the chain-link fence. When Toby finally tried to push back, Derek delivered a sharp punch to Toby's face, splitting his lip and sending him sprawling into a muddy puddle left over from the morning sprinklers. "Keep your mouth shut, or tomorrow is going to be worse," Derek hissed, spitting on Toby's ruined notebooks before the trio jogged away, laughing as the warning bell rang. Toby dragged himself into the school nurse's office 10 minutes later, covered in mud, blood, and tears. The nurse cleaned his split lip with terrifying indifference, handing him an ice pack before sending him to the principal's office. Principal Harrison was an exhausted administrator who cared more about the school's public image and avoiding paperwork than the safety of his students. He looked at Toby over the rim of his glasses, sighing heavily. "Toby, we've talked about this," Harrison said, leaning back in his leather chair. You need to stop antagonizing the older boys. If you just stayed out of their way, these accidents wouldn't happen." "He hit me!" Toby cried, pointing to his swollen lip. "They broke my backpack." "Boys will be boys, Toby," Harrison replied dismissively. "Derek claims you tripped and fell into the fence, and 2 other students corroborated his story. I can't suspend a student based on your word alone. I'm sending you home for the day to clean up. I'll call your mother." Toby knew calling his mother meant she would lose a shift's pay to come get him, putting them further in debt. Defeated, shattered, and feeling utterly abandoned by the world, Toby walked out of the office. He didn't wait for his mother. He just started walking. He didn't go home. He went to the only place where someone hadn't looked at him with disgust or pity. An hour later, Mike Gallagher was still at Centennial Park. He hadn't planned on returning, but he had felt a strange, restless energy all morning. He was polishing the chrome exhaust pipes of his Harley when he heard a quiet, ragged sob behind him. Mike turned around. The rag dropped from his hand. Toby stood there, trembling. His face was a mess of dirt and drying blood. His lip was swollen to twice its size. A dark purple bruise was already blooming on his cheekbone, and his clothes were ripped and caked in wet mud. He was clutching the severed strap of his ruined backpack in one hand. Mike's blood ran cold, instantly replaced by a boiling, terrifying rage. The towering biker closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, dropping to one knee so he was eye level with the boy. "Who did this?" Mike demanded, his voice dangerously low. Toby couldn't hold it in anymore. The dam broke. He collapsed forward, burying his face into Mike's heavy leather vest, sobbing uncontrollably. He cried for the pain. He cried for his ruined lunchbox. And he cried because he was just so tired of being afraid. Mike didn't push him away. The terrifying enforcer of the Hells Angels wrapped his massive, tattooed arms around the small boy, letting him ruin his club colors with mud and tears. He held him steady until the sobs subsided into hiccups. "Tell me," Mike said softly, pulling back just enough to look Toby in the eye. Stammering, Toby told him everything. He told him about Derek Thompson. He told him about the ambush by the portable classrooms. And most importantly, he told him about Principal Harrison, who had looked the other way and sent him home for bleeding on the carpet. As Toby spoke, Mike's demeanor completely changed. The grieving, broken man from yesterday was gone. In his place was a stone-cold tactician, a man who organized defense strategies for an international motorcycle club. The Hells Angels operated on a strict, unyielding code of respect. You didn't touch women, and you never touched children. Principal Harrison, huh? Mike muttered, standing up. He seemed to grow another foot in height, blocking out the sun. And Derek Thompson. Okay, Toby. Mike reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a heavy, black smartphone. He dialed a number from memory, pressing the phone to his ear. "Yeah, it's Mike," he said into the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to Richard Reaper Hayes, the president of the Bakersfield Charter. "Reaper, I need a favor," Mike said, his eyes never leaving Toby's bruised face. "No, not club business. Personal. But I need the whole charter." Mike paused, listening to the gruff voice on the other end. A grim, dangerous smile spread across his scarred face. "Yeah. Tomorrow morning. 7:30 a.m. We're taking a kid to school." Mike hung up the phone and looked down at Toby. "You clean up tonight, kid. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, you're not walking to school alone." That evening, the small, cramped apartment felt like a prison cell to Toby. He spent an hour in the bathroom, carefully washing the dried blood from his face with a ratty washcloth, wincing every time the rough fabric brushed his split lip. When his mother, Sarah, finally unlocked the front door just past midnight, smelling of stale diner coffee and industrial bleach, Toby was pretending to be asleep. He lay stiffly under his thin blanket, breathing in a slow, measured rhythm. Sarah cracked his bedroom door open, a sliver of hallway light falling across his bed. She lingered for a moment, her exhausted sigh filling the quiet room, before pulling the door shut. Toby let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He couldn't bear to see the look of absolute defeat in her eyes, if she saw his bruised face. She was already carrying the weight of the world. He refused to add his own suffering to her load. But as the first pale rays of dawn crept through his window blinds, the terror returned. Today was Wednesday. Derek had promised worse. Toby sat on the edge of his bed, his stomach churning with nauseating dread. He dressed slowly, pulling on a clean but faded graphic tee, and his only pair of jeans that didn't have holes in the knees. He gathered his school supplies, stuffing them into a plastic grocery bag since his backpack was destroyed. At 7:15 a.m., Sarah kissed him on the forehead on her way out the door for her morning shift, too rushed to notice the faint swelling that still lingered on his cheek in the dim light of the kitchen. "Have a good day, sweetie. Lock the door behind you," she called out, the deadbolt clicking shut. Toby sat at the small Formica kitchen table, staring at the clock. 7:20. 7:25. It was time to go. His legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at him to crawl back into bed and hide, but the school would just call his mother. He had no choice. He walked out onto the front porch of their duplex, locking the door with a trembling hand. The neighborhood was quiet, the heavy morning air still damp with dew. Then the silence broke. It started as a low, distant vibration, a bass note that seemed to hum through the very concrete of the sidewalk. Toby paused at the bottom of his porch steps. The sound grew louder, shifting from a hum to a deep, synchronized roar. It sounded like an earthquake rolling down Elm Street. Down at the intersection, a police cruiser with its lights flashing rounded the corner, moving slowly. But the police car wasn't chasing anyone. It was leading an escort. Behind the cruiser, turning onto Toby's narrow residential street, was a tidal wave of chrome, leather, and roaring V-twin engines. It wasn't just Mike. It was the entire Bakersfield charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, flanked by members from neighboring chapters who had answered the call. Over 60 heavily modified Harley-Davidsons rumbled in a perfect, staggered formation. The noise was deafening, a glorious, terrifying symphony of combustion that rattled the windows of every house on the block. Neighbors spilled out onto their front lawns, clutching coffee mugs, their eyes wide with shock and fear as the infamous 1%er Outlaw Club took over their quiet street. At the front of the pack rode Mike Gallagher. His massive frame was unmistakable. Riding parallel to him was a man with a graying, slicked-back ponytail and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Richard Reaper Hayes, the president of the charter. Mike raised a gloved fist. In perfect unison, the entire column of bikers engaged their clutches and brought the roaring beasts to a halt right in front of Toby's duplex. The engines idled, filling the air with the sharp scent of unburned gasoline and hot exhaust. Mike kicked his kickstand down and dismounted. He walked up the cracked concrete path, his heavy engineer boots thudding against the pavement. He looked down at Toby, his pale blue eyes softening just a fraction. "Told you weren't walking alone today, kid," Mike rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly over the idling engines. From behind, Mike stepped Reaper. The president of the charter looked intimidating enough to make grown men cross the street, but he knelt down to Toby's eye level. In his hands, he held a small, custom-made leather vest. It was a perfect miniature of the cuts the men wore. On the back, instead of the full-winged death's head patch, which had to be earned through blood and years of loyalty, it bore a custom rocker that read, "Honorary Prospect," above the word Bakersfield. "Mike here says you're a tough kid," Reaper said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. "Says you share your rations when a man is down. In our world, that makes you a brother, and nobody lays a hand on our brothers." Reaper held out the vest. Toby, his hands shaking with a mixture of awe and adrenaline, slipped his arms through the armholes. It smelled of fresh leather and motor oil. It fit perfectly. "All right, mount up," Mike said, pulling a spare, glossy black helmet from the sissy bar of his bike. He strapped it securely onto Toby's head. Mike lifted the boy with ease, setting him on the passenger pillion of his massive motorcycle. "Hold on to my belt. Don't let go." Toby wrapped his small arms around Mike's thick leather belt, gripping the heavy buckle. Mike swung his leg over the bike and kicked it into gear. He looked over at Reaper, who gave a sharp nod. With a twist of the throttle, Mike's bike roared back to life, louder than before. The entire column followed suit. The procession began to move, a mile-long parade of raw horsepower and uncompromising muscle, winding its way through the streets of Bakersfield. Toby had never felt anything like it. The wind whipped past his visor, the vibrations of the massive Evo motor resonating in his chest. He wasn't the scared, bullied kid from the duplex anymore. He was riding with giants. As they passed the convenience store where Derek usually hung out, Toby saw a group of teenagers drop their skateboards and stare in open-mouthed disbelief. Toby didn't shrink away. He sat up straighter, his small hands gripping Mike's belt tightly. Oak Creek Elementary was a beehive of morning activity. Yellow school buses were lining up in the designated loop, and hundreds of children were swarming the front courtyard. Parents were dropping off their kids in the car line. Teachers were blowing whistles, and the morning crossing guards were waving their stop signs. Then, the ground began to shake. The crossing guard at the main intersection blew her whistle, but the sound was completely drowned out by the approaching thunder. The police escort pulled into the school's main driveway, blocking both lanes of traffic. Behind it, the Hells Angels arrived. Panic and confusion rippled through the crowd of parents and teachers. Mothers grabbed their children, pulling them back onto the grass. The school buses halted in their tracks. 60 roaring Harley-Davidsons poured into the bus loop, ignoring every traffic rule, painted line and crossing zone. They parked in a massive, sweeping semicircle that completely blockaded the front entrance of the school. The engines cut out in a cascading wave of silence, but the tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 60 heavily tattooed, leather-clad outlaw bikers dismounted. They didn't shout, they didn't make a scene. They just stood there. A silent, imposing wall of muscle and leather, radiating an aura of absolute danger. Mike Gallagher walked his bike forward, stopping right at the base of the concrete steps that led to the main double doors. He reached back and lifted Toby off the seat, setting him gently on the ground. Toby stood in his oversized helmet and his custom leather cut, clutching his plastic grocery bag of school supplies. The sea of students parted like the Red Sea. Standing frozen near the brick retaining wall was Derek Thompson and his 2 older cronies. The color had completely drained from Derek's face. He looked like he was going to be sick. Mike placed a heavy hand on Toby's shoulder and guided him up the steps. The other bikers closed in behind them, forming an impenetrable, terrifying tunnel of escorts. "Which one is he?" Mike asked quietly. Toby raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at Derek. Mike didn't alter his pace. He walked Toby straight toward the bully. Derek's friends immediately scattered, abandoning him. Derek tried to back away, but his back hit the brick wall. He was trapped. Mike stopped inches from the terrified 12-year-old. The towering enforcer looked down at Derek, his scarred face devoid of any emotion. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "This boy is under our protection," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "If he trips on a shoelace, if he gets a paper cut, if he comes home with a speck of dirt on his shirt, I'm not going to talk to the principal. I'm going to come find you." Do we understand each other?" Derek, trembling so violently his teeth were chattering, could only manage a frantic, jerky nod. "Good," Mike grunted, turning his back on the boy. Suddenly, the front doors of the school flew open. Principal Harrison burst out, his face flushed red with indignation, flanked by two nervous-looking campus security guards. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison barked, his voice cracking slightly as he took in the sheer number of bikers occupying his bus loop. "You can't be here. This is a school zone. I'm calling the police." "We brought the police with us, Harrison," Reaper said, stepping out from the crowd and walking up the steps to stand beside Mike. Harrison faltered, recognizing the man's undeniable authority. "You are trespassing. You are intimidating my students." Reaper pulled a thick manila envelope from the inside of his leather cut and slapped it hard against Harrison's chest, forcing the principal to grab it. "That is a compilation of every emergency room visit, every documented bruise, and every ignored complaint regarding Toby Jenkins over the last 6 months," Reaper said, his singular eye boring a hole through the administrator. "And the legal documentation at the back is from our club's retainer attorney up in Oakland. It outlines gross negligence, child endangerment, and a failure to enforce the district's anti-bullying mandate. If you ever dismiss this boy's injuries again, we will bankrupt this school district, and we will personally ensure you never work in education again." Harrison opened the envelope with trembling hands, scanning the legal letterhead. His arrogant facade crumbled instantly. He looked at Toby, then back at the towering bikers, realizing with horrifying clarity that he had just stepped into a war he could not win. "We will ensure Toby's absolute safety from now on," Harrison stammered, sweating profusely. "You're damn right you will," Reaper sneered. Mike knelt down in front of Toby one last time, unbuckling the heavy black helmet. He ruffled the boy's hair. "You go to class, kid. Hold your head up. You're never going to be afraid again. You hear me?" Toby looked at Mike, tears welling in his eyes. Not from fear, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in his life, he felt safe. "Thank you, Mike." "No," Mike said softly, tapping the breast pocket of his vest, where a piece of tin foil still rested. "Thank you for the sandwich." The angels didn't leave immediately. They stood on the lawn, their arms crossed, watching like silent sentinels as Toby walked through the front doors. As he passed down the hallway, students stepped aside, whispering in awe. He wasn't the weird, poor kid anymore. He was the kid who rode with the angels. Derek Thompson transferred to a different school district 3 days later. Principal Harrison was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation initiated by the mysterious Los Angeles attorney. As for Mike Gallagher, the empty, aching hole left by his brother's death finally began to heal. He started showing up at the Jenkins duplex on weekends, helping Sarah fix her car and teaching Toby how to use a wrench. A half-eaten peanut butter sandwich hadn't just saved a boy from a bully. It had given a lost, hardened outlaw a reason to care again. What an incredible true story of brotherhood and unexpected heroes. Sometimes, the most terrifying people on the outside have the biggest hearts on the inside, proving that a single act of kindness can literally change your life. If this story gave you chills and warmed your heart, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing real-life stories.